Behind the locked hallway of Harbor Lights Senior Care, former Navy SEAL Ethan Miller stood frozen beside his loyal K-9 Ranger as he watched a scene no son should ever see. His elderly mother, Ruth, sat trembling in a wheelchair while Denise Carlson, the woman every family trusted, gripped her bruised wrist and forced a pen toward her shaking hand. Then Ranger erupted into furious barking. Beyond the memory care door, an old widow lay forgotten in a freezing bathing room, her lips turning blue, fear filling her eyes like someone waiting to be erased. Ethan had survived war overseas, but nothing prepared him for the horror hiding inside this quiet senior care home. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more heartfelt stories of faith, courage, loyalty, and second chances. Snow buried Bar Harbor, Maine, beneath a white February silence, while the Atlantic wind clawed through the empty streets like winter itself had learned how to mourn. Ethan Miller drove through that storm with both hands steady on the wheel of his black pickup, the headlights cutting weak tunnels through the swirling snow. At 41, Ethan was a retired Navy SEAL senior chief, tall and broad-shouldered, with a lean, hardened frame that still carried the discipline of years spent moving through darkness where one careless breath could betray a man. His short, dark brown hair was trimmed close, more from habit than style, and a faint beard shadow roughened his square jaw. His pale blue eyes had the calm, watchful look of deep water before a storm, quiet on the surface, dangerous underneath. War had not made Ethan cruel, but it had made him careful. It had taught him that evil rarely announced itself with thunder. Sometimes it smiled, opened doors, and called itself care. Beside him sat Ranger, a retired K-9 German Shepherd, 9 years old, with thick black and tan fur, a silvered muzzle, and amber eyes that missed almost nothing. Ranger had once moved beside Ethan through ruined streets overseas, sniffing out danger before men with rifles even knew death was near. Now, age had stiffened the dog's hips and whitened the fur around his face, but his loyalty remained sharp as a blade. He sat upright in the passenger seat, silent and alert, his ears flicking each time the wind slapped snow against the windows. Ethan reached over and touched the dog's neck. "Almost there, old man," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Ranger or to himself. Harbor Lights. Senior Care appeared at the edge of town, glowing yellow behind frozen pine trees. From the outside it looked warm and harmless, a wide wooden building with flower boxes buried under snow and a painted sign promising dignity, comfort, and compassion. Ethan stared at that sign longer than he meant to. His mother, Ruth Miller, had always hated words that tried too hard. "Real kindness doesn't need a banner," she used to say, usually while handing soup to a sick neighbor or tutoring a child whose parents could not pay her. Ruth was 76 now, a small, retired elementary school teacher with silver hair usually pinned in a neat low bun, soft blue eyes, and hands that had spent 40 years guiding pencils, tying shoelaces, wiping tears, and raising one stubborn boy into a man. She had been gentle, yes, but never weak. Ethan remembered her standing in their kitchen after his father died, thin but unbroken, telling him grief was a wolf that could follow them, but it did not get to lead the way. The woman waiting inside Harbor Lights was supposed to be that same woman. Yet, when Ethan stepped into the lobby with Ranger at his side, something in his chest tightened. The air smelled of disinfectant, reheated coffee, and old carpet. A television murmured in the corner, but no one seemed to be watching it. Behind the reception desk stood Denise Carlson, the facility manager. She looked about 50, tall and slender, with honey blonde hair swept into a perfect twist, pale skin carefully powdered, and a cream-colored blouse beneath a navy blazer. Her smile was graceful, practiced, almost tender, the kind of smile that could calm worried families before they realized it had given them no real answers. "Mr. Miller," she said warmly, stepping forward with both hands clasped, "we're so glad you made it through the weather." Ethan shook her hand once. Her fingers were cool and dry. Ranger did not move. He stood beside Ethan's leg, staring past Denise toward the hallway behind her. "I'm here for my mother," Ethan said. "Of course," Denise replied. "Ruth is resting. She's had a little confusion this week, nothing unusual at her age, but we'd like to keep her under observation a bit longer." The words were soft, too soft. Ethan felt them slide through the room like oil over water. Ranger's ears rose. A low growl rolled from his chest, quiet but unmistakable. Denise's smile flickered for half a heartbeat before returning. "Protective, isn't he?" she asked. "Saskikegt?" Ethan rested a hand on Ranger's back. "Only when he has a reason." Denise led them down a polished hallway lined with framed photographs of smiling residents. Some elderly patients sat in wheelchairs near the walls, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale under fluorescent lights. A few glanced up at Ethan, then quickly looked away when Denise passed. Ethan noticed that. Ranger noticed more. At the end of the hall, beneath a small sign reading "Memory Care," staff only, the dog stopped walking. His body stiffened and his growl deepened. Denise turned smoothly. "Your mother is this way." Ruth Miller sat by the window in a wheelchair. A faded blue cardigan crooked over her thin shoulders, her silver hair pinned loosely as if someone had done it in a hurry. She looked smaller than Ethan remembered. Not just older, reduced. Her hands trembled beneath a gray blanket, and when she saw him she smiled too quickly. "There's my boy," she whispered. Ethan knelt beside her. Suddenly, not a seal, not a warrior, only a son trying not to show fear. He took her hand and felt how cold her fingers were. "You okay, Mom?" Ruth nodded. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But as she shifted, her sleeve slipped back. Round her wrist were dark bruises, shaped like fingers. Ethan looked at them. Ruth saw his eyes change and quickly pulled the sleeve down. "It's nothing," she said. "I bruise easily now." Behind him, Ranger gave one low, warning growl toward the hallway. Ethan stayed still, his hand gently covering his mother's trembling fingers. Outside, snow pressed against the window like 1,000 silent witnesses. Harbor lights looked peaceful from the road, warm as a lantern in the storm. But Ethan Miller had spent half his life learning the difference between peace and camouflage, and in his mother's frightened eyes he saw the first crack in the mask. Ethan Miller returned to Harbor Lights Senior Care the next morning before the snowplows had finished clearing the road. The storm had weakened overnight, but Bar Harbor still looked half-buried, its fishing boats frozen in the harbor and its pine trees bent beneath white weight. He did not arrive angry. Anger was loud, and loud men were easy to manage. Ethan had learned long ago, in places where moonlight touched rifle barrels and silence carried farther than screams, that the patient man usually saw what others tried to hide. Ranger walked beside him through the front doors, his paws clicking softly against the polished floor, his black and tan coat brushed clean, his silvered muzzle pointed forward like an old soldier returning to a battlefield he had not chosen. The lobby looked exactly as it had the day before. Soft yellow lamps, framed photographs of smiling residents, a bowl of peppermints on the reception desk, and a faint smell of disinfectant wrapped around the building like perfume over rot. Denise Carlson was not at the front desk that morning, but her presence seemed to live in the walls. A few residents sat near the windows in wheelchairs, their blankets tucked neatly around their knees. One old man, thin as a fence rail, with cloudy gray eyes and a white mustache that trembled when he breathed, looked up when Ranger passed. His name tag read Leonard Pike. He appeared to be in his late 80s, with a long narrow face and the fragile dignity of a man who had once worn suits and polished his shoes every Sunday. For 1 second, Leonard's eyes met Ethan's. Then, the sound of Denise's heels came from the hallway, and Leonard dropped his gaze to his lap as if someone had pulled a string in his spine. Ethan noticed. Ranger noticed too. Denise entered the lobby wearing a pale blue dress beneath a cream cardigan, her honey blonde hair twisted perfectly again, her smile warm enough to fool a grieving family and cold enough to freeze anyone who had seen what lay behind it. "Mr. Miller," she said, as if surprised and delighted. "Back so soon?" Ethan gave a small nod. "I told my mother I would visit." "Of course," Denise replied. "Ruth loves seeing you. We only ask that visits remain calm. Too much excitement can confuse her." The word confuse landed softly, but Ethan heard the hook beneath it. He said nothing. A younger aide passing behind Denise slowed just enough to listen. She was a round-faced girl in her early 20s with dark hair tucked under a cheap plastic clip, tired brown eyes, and the nervous expression of someone still new enough to feel guilt but already trained enough to hide it. Denise glanced at her once, and the girl hurried away with a laundry cart. Ethan followed Denise down the hallway, watching the building breathe around her. Conversations faded when she passed. A woman in a pink robe stopped telling another resident about her grandson. Leonard Pike turned his wheelchair slightly toward the wall. An elderly woman with soft white curls, pearl earrings, and hands twisted by arthritis fumbled with a spoon at her breakfast tray. The spoon slipped and clattered to the floor. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at it, cheeks reddening with shame. No one moved. A male orderly at the far end of the dining area gave an impatient sigh but did not come over. Ethan bent, picked up the spoon, and placed it gently back on her tray. "Thank you," the woman whispered without looking at him. Her voice was so small it seemed afraid of being heard. Ruth was sitting near the window when Ethan entered her room. The same gray blanket folded over her knees, the same faded blue cardigan hanging loosely from her narrow shoulders. Morning light touched her silver hair, which had been pinned unevenly, leaving a few wisps loose around her pale face. She smiled when she saw him, but it came too quickly, like a curtain pulled before a cracked window. "Ethan," she said, "you shouldn't have driven through all this snow." "I've driven through worse." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Her skin felt cool. Ranger moved to her chair and rested his head against her knee. Ruth's thin fingers found his ears, and for a moment something real softened her face. "Hello, handsome," she whispered to the dog. "Still taking care of my boy?" Ranger did not wag his tail. His amber eyes moved from Ruth's cup of water to the small paper medication cup sitting beside her breakfast. He sniffed once, then drew back, ears tightening. Ethan watched the movement carefully. "You eating okay?" he asked. Ruth looked down at the untouched oatmeal on her tray. "I'm just not hungry this morning. Were you hungry yesterday?" She folded her hands under the blanket. "Sweetheart, don't start." That old word should have comforted him. Instead, it made his chest ache. His mother had called him sweetheart when he was 6 and bleeding from a bicycle fall, when he was 18 and leaving for the Navy, when he was 32 and standing in dress blues at his father's funeral. She used it now like a bandage pressed over a wound she refused to show. Ethan pulled a chair close and sat beside her. "Mom, your wrist was bruised yesterday." Ruth's eyes flicked toward the door. It was brief, almost nothing, but Ethan had spent 20 years reading almost nothing. "I bump into things," she said. "These old bones don't negotiate like they used to." "That's funny," Ethan said quietly. "You used to tell me bones were honest. They only hurt when something happened to them." A faint smile touched her mouth, then disappeared. "I said too many things when you were little." "No," he said. "You said the things that stayed." Before Ruth could answer, Denise appeared at the doorway with a clipboard held against her chest. "How are we feeling today, Ruth?" she asked in a bright voice. Ruth's fingers tightened beneath the blanket. "Fine. Wonderful." Denise looked at Ethan. She had a restless night, so the nurse gave her something to help her sleep. Completely normal. Ranger rose slowly. A low sound stirred in his chest. Denise's eyes dropped to him, and for the first time Ethan saw irritation flash beneath her polish. Perhaps Ranger should wait in the lobby next time. Some residents are sensitive to large dogs. "Ranger is certified," Ethan said. "He stays with me." Denise smiled, but it no longer reached her eyes. "Of course." After she left, Ruth would not speak for several minutes. Ethan did not press her. Pressure broke, frightened people faster than truth freed them. He spent the next 2 hours watching the rhythm of harbor lights. Medication carts appeared at exact times. Residents swallowed pills without questions. Those who hesitated received gentle voices first, then firm hands. One woman became drowsy so quickly after her dose that her chin dropped toward her chest before lunch was over. Leonard Pike tried to ask an aide if he could call his daughter, but the aide told him calls were scheduled for tomorrow. He accepted the answer like a man accepting weather. Near the nurse's station, Ethan noticed a woman he had not seen before. Olivia Grant looked about 34, tall but slightly stooped from exhaustion, with auburn brown hair twisted into a loose knot that kept threatening to fall apart. Her skin was fair, her cheekbones sharp, and her gray-blue eyes carried the bruised alertness of someone who had spent too many nights choosing between conscience and survival. Unlike the others, she knelt when speaking to residents, bringing her face level with theirs. She adjusted a blanket around the arthritic woman from breakfast and wiped spilled tea from Leonard's sleeve without making him feel foolish. When she saw Ethan watching, she looked away too fast. Later, while Denise was speaking to a visiting couple near the lobby, Olivia passed Ruth's room with a stack of towels. Ethan stepped into the hall. "Nurse Grant?" She stopped. Her name tag hung crookedly against navy scrubs. "Yes?" "My mother seems heavily medicated." Olivia's eyes moved once toward the security camera in the corner. "You should discuss medication concerns with administration. I'm discussing what I can see." Her jaw tightened. Up close, Ethan saw faint shadows beneath her eyes and a small scar near her left eyebrow, pale against her skin. "Mr. Miller," she said carefully, "your mother has been marked for increased observation." "By who?" Olivia swallowed. "Denise." "Why?" Olivia's fingers tightened around the towels. "The chart says Ruth has shown signs of confusion and emotional instability." Ethan felt something cold settle behind his ribs. "My mother taught second grade for 40 years. She remembers every birthday of every child she ever taught. I'm not saying the chart is right." The words came out before Olivia could stop them. Fear crossed her face immediately. She looked down the hall, then lowered her voice. "They're considering moving her to memory care." "When?" "Soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day." Ethan said nothing, but inside him the world narrowed the way it had before a breach. Door, distance, threat, hostage. Olivia took a small step back. "I shouldn't have said that." "But you did." Her eyes shone for a second. Not with tears exactly, but with the exhaustion of carrying a truth too long. "Please don't make it obvious I told you." Then she walked away before he could ask more. By evening, snow began falling again, fine and sharp against the windows. Ethan stayed until visiting hours ended, helping Ruth sip water, telling her harmless stories about the harbor, pretending not to see how often she checked the doorway. When he finally stood to leave, Ruth caught his hand. Her grip was weak but desperate. "Don't be angry here," she whispered. "People pay for anger." Ethan looked at her, and the boy inside him, the one who had once believed his mother could scare away every monster, felt something crack. "I'm not angry," he said. "Not yet." Ranger walked beside him down the dim hallway toward the exit. Then, without warning, the dog stopped. His body stiffened in front of the door marked Memory Care, staff only. He lowered his muzzle to the narrow gap beneath it and inhaled hard. His ears rose. A growl gathered deep in his chest, older than training, older than war. Then he began to scratch at the tile with one paw, slow at first, then harder, his claws ticking like a warning bell. Ethan crouched beside him and listened. At first, there was only the hum of the heater and the distant murmur of a television. Then he heard it, a small, broken sound from somewhere beyond the locked door, a woman crying softly. Not confused crying, not wandering, empty noise. This was fear trying to stay quiet. Ethan's hand closed around Ranger's collar. Behind that door someone was begging the dark not to notice her. And in the soft yellow light of harbor lights, Ethan understood that his mother was not the only one trapped inside a place built to look like mercy. By evening, the storm had returned to Bar Harbor with a meaner voice, throwing snow against Harbor Light's senior care as if the sea itself had climbed the hill to beat on the windows. Ethan Miller parked beneath a flickering lot lamp with Ruth's navy wool coat folded across his arm, the one she used to wear on Sunday mornings when she still insisted on walking to church even in weather that made younger people invent excuses. It was a simple reason to come back, harmless enough for a front desk, but Ethan knew he was not really there for the coat. He was there because Ranger had heard a woman cry behind a locked door and because his mother had gripped his hand like someone standing at the edge of a well. The building looked different at night. During the day, Harbor Lights wore its kindness like a fresh tablecloth. After sunset, the same halls seemed longer, the same yellow lamps weaker, the same framed photographs of smiling residents almost cruel. Ranger stepped from the truck first, his thick black and tan fur speckled with snow, his silver muzzle lifted toward the building. The old German shepherd did not bark. That would have been easier. Instead, he became terribly still, the way he used to become before finding hidden wires in ruined streets half a world away. Ethan touched the dog's collar and felt the vibration already gathering in his chest. "Easy," he whispered. Ranger did not look at him. Inside, the young aide at the desk barely looked up when Ethan said he had forgotten his mother's coat. She was the same round-faced girl from the morning, with tired brown eyes and a plastic hair clip holding back dark strands that kept falling loose. Her name tag read Kayla, and she looked no older than 22, the kind of girl who had probably taken the job because she wanted to help people before discovering that institutions could teach kindness to keep its head down. "Room 118, she said, sliding the visitor sheet toward him. "Just be quick. Night routine started." Ethan signed his name. Ranger was already facing the west hallway. The lights flickered once, dimmed, then came back with a soft buzz. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a cartwheel squealed across tile. Ethan walked toward Ruth's room, but Ranger stopped before they reached it. His ears rose, his nose dropped to the floor. Then he pulled hard, not toward memory care's main door this time, but toward a narrower side corridor marked laundry and maintenance. Ethan let him lead. A SEAL learned early that pride got men killed. Sometimes the smartest man in a room was the dog. The corridor was colder than the others, with gray walls, old pipes ticking overhead, and the smell of bleach hiding something damp underneath. Ranger moved with purpose, claws clicking quickly now, past stacked linen bins and a half-open closet full of mop handles. At the end stood a faded door with a small sign that read, "Assisted Bathing, Out of Service." The sign was crooked, hanging by one screw. Ranger pressed his nose to the gap beneath the door and let out a low whine that made Ethan's skin tighten. From inside came the sound again, weaker than before. Not a full cry, but a broken breath, a tiny animal sound made by someone trying not to disappear. Ethan pushed the door. It stuck. He put his shoulder into it once, not hard enough to break the frame, just enough to force swollen wood against old hinges. The door opened into a tiled bathing room that felt colder than the hallway. A fluorescent light blinked overhead. Water had pooled near a drain in the center of the floor, thin and shining like a sheet of ice. Beside a wall-mounted shower chair sat an elderly woman, trapped half sideways, wrapped only in a thin hospital blanket that had slipped from one shoulder. She was tiny, bird-boned, perhaps 82, with cotton-white hair flattened against her skull, skin nearly translucent, and lips touched blue from cold. Her face was deeply lined but delicate, as if life had folded her many times without tearing her completely. Her wristband read Mabel Turner. She looked at Ethan with huge, frightened gray eyes, too lucid for anyone to dismiss as confused. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean to bother anybody." Something in Ethan went very quiet. Not calm, quiet. The kind of quiet that came before doors were breached and names were remembered. Ranger moved first, stepping carefully through the water and pressing his warm body against Mabel's legs. The dog lowered his head into her lap, giving her something solid to hold. Mabel's trembling fingers clutched his fur with desperate softness. "Good boy," she breathed, teeth chattering. Oh, good boy. Ethan pulled off his field jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Ma'am, I'm Ethan. I'm going to get you warm. They said they'd come back, Mabel murmured. I kept counting songs in my head. I got to 37. Her voice cracked. Then I forgot the words. Footsteps hurried behind him. Olivia Grant appeared in the doorway, wearing navy scrubs under a thin gray sweater, her auburn brown hair falling loose from its knot, her gray-blue eyes widening when she saw Mabel. Olivia was still young, but exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes and sharpened the angles of her face. She looked like a woman who had spent too many nights swallowing screams and calling them professionalism. "Oh my God," she whispered. She rushed in, dropped to her knees, and touched Mabel's cheek. "Mabel, honey, how long have you been here?" Mabel tried to answer but only shook. Olivia's face changed. Fear, guilt, anger, each crossed it like lightning behind clouds. "Get blankets from the warmer," Ethan said. Olivia did not argue. She ran. Ethan stayed with Mabel, checking her pulse, keeping his voice low, while Ranger pressed close like a living hearth. When Olivia returned with blankets, she wrapped Mabel with hands that trembled harder than the old woman's. "This wasn't an accident," Ethan said. Olivia froze. "People forget things during night shift," she said. But the lie had no bones in it. Ethan looked at her. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. A woman does not get left in a closed bathing room, half wet, during a snowstorm, unless everyone is too scared to ask where she went. Olivia's eyes filled, though no tears fell. "You don't understand what she does." "Denise?" Olivia looked toward the hall. "She calls it behavior management. If residents complain, if they call family too much, if they resist medication, she labels them difficult. Memory care gives her control. Doors, schedules, phone access, medication changes, everything." Mabel whimpered softly under the blankets. Olivia lowered her voice until it was nearly gone. "Reports get rewritten. Fall injuries become confusion episodes. Missed meals become patient refusal. Extra sedatives keep people quiet at night. Families only see the birthday photos, the clean sweaters, the smiling visits Denise arranges." Ethan felt his mother's cold fingers in his memory. "Ruth." Olivia closed her eyes. "Your mother has been asking questions. She asked why Leonard Pike couldn't call his daughter. She asked why Mabel was crying last week. Denise doesn't like residents who notice things. They got Mabel into a wheelchair and moved her to a warm observation room, where Olivia promised to check her temperature and document what she could before anyone erased it. Ethan wanted to stay, but Ranger suddenly turned toward Ruth's hallway, his body stiff again. Ruth was awake when Ethan entered, sitting beneath the dim bedside lamp with her hands folded too neatly in her lap. The navy coat lay across Ethan's arm like a relic from another life. "You came back," she said, and there was relief in her voice before fear chased it away. Ethan placed the coat over the chair. "Where's your necklace?" Ruth's hand rose automatically to her throat. The motion was so quick, so nakedly wounded, that Ethan knew before she spoke. For as long as he could remember, Ruth had worn a small silver locket. Inside it was a faded picture of Ethan at 9 years old, sunburned and grinning in a Little League uniform, missing one front tooth and convinced he would one day pitch for Boston. She had worn it when he left for boot camp. She had worn it at his father's funeral. She had worn it through every deployment, telling him once that if prayer needed an anchor, hers had one. Now her throat was bare. "Denise said it could get lost," Ruth whispered. "She said she'd keep it safe." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did you give it to her?" Ruth looked toward the door. "She said I agreed." That was answer enough. Ranger moved to Ruth's chair and placed his head beneath her hand. Ruth stroked him slowly, tears bright but unshed. "I don't want to be trouble," she said. Ethan knelt before her. "Mom, you are not trouble. Old people become trouble when they need too much." The sentence sounded rehearsed, as if someone had planted it in her and watered it daily. Ethan felt grief rise in him, dark and ancient. His mother had taught generations of children to write their names, and now someone was teaching her to erase her own. Olivia appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, pale and shaking. She glanced behind her before stepping inside. "She's doing it tomorrow," she said. Ethan stood. "Doing what?" Olivia's voice broke into a whisper. "Denise has papers prepared. A statement that Ruth's bruises came from a fall, consent for medication adjustment, and a financial power of attorney form." Ruth made a small sound barely human. Ethan did not move, but something inside him locked into place, cold and exact. Olivia looked at him with fear and hope fighting in her tired eyes. "She'll try to make your mother sign in the morning." Outside, the storm battered harbor lights, rattling the windows like bones in a box. Inside, Ethan rested one hand on Ranger's head and looked at his mother's bare throat, where the locket should have been. The enemy had finally shown its shape. Morning came to Bar Harbor without mercy, gray and bitter, with snow packed against the windows of Harbor Lights Senior Care like the whole town had been sealed inside a cold white tomb. Ethan Miller arrived before the official visiting hour, his black pickup rolling into the nearly empty parking lot while the first weak light of dawn struggled behind the storm clouds. He had not slept. He had sat at his kitchen table until sunrise with Ranger lying at his feet, Ruth's missing silver locket burning in his mind like a small stolen star. The old German shepherd had not slept much either. Ranger had paced from the door to the window through the night, his silvered muzzle lifting every time the wind moved branches against the cabin wall. Now, as Ethan stepped from the truck, Ranger jumped down beside him with a sharpness that made him seem younger than his 9 years, his black and tan coat bristling along the spine, amber eyes locked on the building ahead. Ethan wore a dark weatherproof jacket over a gray shirt, his jaw rough with a sleepless shadow of beard, his pale blue eyes colder than the morning. He had seen men panic before raids, men rage before firefights, men pray when the world narrowed to a door and a command. He felt none of those things now. What lived in him was quieter and more dangerous. Purpose. Inside the lobby, the young aide Kayla looked startled when she saw him. Her round face was pale under the fluorescent lights, and her dark hair was clipped back unevenly as if she had dressed in a hurry. "Mr. Miller," she said, forcing a nervous smile, "visiting hours don't start for another 30 minutes. Ethan signed the visitor sheet without looking away from the hallway. "I'm early." "Ms. Carlson might want—" Ranger suddenly pulled hard toward the west corridor, the leash snapping tight in Ethan's hand. Kayla stopped speaking. The dog did not bark. He moved fast, nose low, body rigid, following something no human in that polished lobby could see. Ethan let him lead. The hallway lights buzzed overhead. A cleaning cart stood abandoned near the nurse's station. Somewhere behind a half-closed door, an old man coughed twice, then fell silent. Ranger moved past Ruth's room, past the dining area, past the memory care sign, and stopped outside a small administrative office near the rear corridor. The door was almost shut, but not completely. Through the narrow gap, Ethan heard Denise Carlson's voice, stripped of all the honey she poured over families during the day. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, Ruth." Ethan stopped beside the wall. Ranger's chest began to vibrate. Inside the room, Denise continued in a low, sharp tone. "Your son is unstable. I know that hurts to hear, but men who come back from war often see threats where none exist. If you let him keep upsetting you, I'll have no choice but to restrict his visits." Ruth's voice came next, thin and shaking. "Ethan is not unstable." "Then why did he bring a military dog into a care facility and frighten residents?" Denise asked. "Why did he corner staff members last night? Why was he wandering near restricted areas?" Papers shifted on a desk. "This form protects everyone. It simply states that your bruises came from a fall, that you agree to a medication adjustment, and that Harbor Lights may coordinate your financial paperwork if you become unable to manage it yourself." Ruth whispered, "I don't want to sign." The silence that followed felt like a blade laid flat against skin. Denise's voice dropped. "Listen carefully. If you refuse, I will recommend immediate transfer to memory care, full-time supervision, limited phone access, no unscheduled visits, and if your son interferes again, I will have him removed from the property. Is that what you want? To become the reason he gets himself in trouble?" Ethan's hand tightened around Ranger's leash until the leather creaked. He looked through the gap. Ruth sat in her wheelchair beside Denise's desk, small and pale in her cream sweater, her silver hair pinned loosely, her bare throat still missing the locket that had anchored her courage for years. Her right hand trembled around a pen. On the desk lay 3 documents, their white pages too bright beneath the lamp. Denise stood over her, tall and elegant in a charcoal dress with a pearl bracelet at her wrist, her honey-blonde hair flawless, her face calm in the cruel way of people who do not fear consequences. "Sign here," Denise said. Ruth shook her head once. Denise reached down and took her wrist, not gently. Ruth flinched, and the pen tip struck the paper in a broken black dot. Ranger exploded. His bark filled the hall like a gunshot. Savage, deep, impossible to ignore. Ethan pushed the door open. Denise jerked backward, and for one raw second the mask fell from her face. Fear flashed there first, then fury. Then, almost beautifully, she repaired herself. Her shoulders straightened, her mouth softened, and she became again the woman on the brochure. "Mr. Miller," she said, breathless but smiling, "you startled us." Ethan stepped into the office. Ranger moved with him, placing himself between Denise and Ruth. "Let go of my mother." Denise's hand had already released Ruth, but the red marks remained around the old woman's wrist. Ethan saw them. Ruth saw him see them. Shame crossed her face, and that hurt him worse than the bruise. Denise lifted both palms slightly, a gesture of innocence. "You've misunderstood. Ruth became anxious during a routine review. I was helping steady her hand." Ethan looked at the documents. A false statement, medication consent, financial power of attorney. Denise's eyes sharpened. "Those are private medical and administrative matters. Not when you force her." "Force?" Denise gave a small laugh, polished and wounded. "Mr. Miller, your mother has been increasingly confused. She imagines things. She becomes frightened, then forgets why. This is exactly why we need safeguards in place." Ruth's breathing grew shallow. Ranger backed closer to her chair, his body tense but controlled. Ethan lowered his voice. "Mom, did you ask for these papers?" Ruth's lips parted. Denise spoke before she could. "Please don't pressure her." Ethan turned his eyes to Denise, and the room seemed to lose temperature. "I asked my mother." Denise's jaw tightened. "This is inappropriate." From the hallway came hurried footsteps. Kayla appeared first, wide-eyed and trembling, followed by a broad man in a Navy security jacket. His name tag read Frank Dorsey. Frank looked about 55, heavy-set, with thinning brown hair, a blunt nose, and a gray mustache that drooped over a mouth trained more for orders than questions. He had the tired, suspicious posture of a man who liked rules because rules saved him from having to choose courage. "Everything okay, Miss Carlson?" he asked. Denise touched her wrist as though she had been the one harmed. "Mr. Miller's dog lunged at me. I need local police contacted." Kayla swallowed hard but said nothing. Ethan saw her eyes flick to Ruth's wrist, then away. Frank reached for the radio clipped to his belt. "Sir, you need to step back." Ranger growled once. Not wild, not confused, only warning. Ethan gave a short command under his breath and the dog went silent, though his gaze never left Denise. Within minutes, Officer Brian Hallowell arrived from the Bar Harbor Police Department, snow melting across the shoulders of his dark uniform. He was in his late 30s, medium height, square-faced, with sandy hair cropped short and tired hazel eyes that suggested he had spent too many Maine winters answering calls where everyone insisted they were the reasonable one. He carried himself carefully, not arrogant, but alert. Denise met him in the hall before Ethan could speak. "Officer, thank goodness. This man is a veteran with possible trauma issues. He has been intimidating staff, upsetting residents, and now his dog has behaved aggressively in an administrative meeting. Ethan watched Officer Hallowell absorb the words. Denise knew how to build a cage out of concern. She did not accuse with rage, she accused with sympathy. "Mr. Miller?" the officer said. Ethan gave his name, calm and even. "My mother was being pressured to sign documents she did not understand." Denise sighed softly. "Ruth understands less and less lately. We are all heartbroken by it." Ruth's hands began to shake harder in her lap. Ethan wanted to kneel beside her, to take her out of that room, to carry her through the storm if he had to, but every instinct told him Denise was waiting for one uncontrolled move, one raised voice, one hard step, one excuse. Officer Hallowell looked at Ranger. "Is a dog trained?" "Retired military working dog," Ethan said, "responds to command." Denise gave another careful sigh. "That may be true, but Harbor Lights cannot risk the safety of vulnerable residents." The word vulnerable came out of her mouth like theft. Officer Hallowell rubbed his jaw, uncomfortable. "Mr. Miller, for now, it might be best if you leave and let things cool down." Ethan looked at Ruth. Her eyes were wet, terrified, apologizing for a crime committed against her. "I'm not leaving her with those papers." "The papers will be set aside for now," the officer said, glancing at Denise. Denise smiled thinly. "Of course." Ethan knew it was not victory. It was a delay. A door not opened, only unlatched. He stepped closer to Ruth and crouched just beyond Ranger's shoulder. "Mom," he said softly, "I'll come back." Ruth looked at Denise, then at the officer, then finally at Ethan. Something changed in her face. It was small, almost hidden beneath fear, but Ethan saw it the way men at sea see the first line of dawn. Her lips trembled. Her voice came out barely above breath. "Don't trust her." No one moved. Denise's face hardened before she could stop it. Officer Hallowell heard it. Kayla heard it. Frank looked down at the floor. Ethan held his mother's gaze. For the first time since he had walked into Harbor Lights, Ruth had not said she was fine. She had said the truth, small as a match in a cathedral of darkness, and Ethan knew he would carry that flame out of the building before Denise could smother it. Ethan Miller left Harbor Lights with Ruth's warning still burning in his ears, small and fierce as a candle cupped against a winter gale. "Don't trust her." 4 words, barely spoken, yet they did more than any scream could have done. They turned grief into direction. By the time he reached his cabin, the storm had softened into a gray snowfall, and Ranger climbed from the truck without his usual slow stiffness, as if the old German shepherd understood that waiting was over. Ethan did not break dishes, did not punch walls, did not call Denise Carlson and threaten her with the kind of voice that had once made armed men reconsider their lives. Rage would have felt good for about 10 seconds. Then it would have handed Denise exactly what she wanted: an unstable veteran, a dangerous dog, a frightened mother, and no proof strong enough to survive daylight. So Ethan sat at the kitchen table beneath a dim lamp, opened an old waterproof notebook from his SEAL years, and began to build the truth like a map. Names, times, medications, bruises, witnesses, places where fear changed the air. Ranger lay beside his chair, head on his paws, amber eyes open, guarding not the door this time, but the silence around his master. Near midnight, Ethan's phone buzzed. The message came from Olivia Grant. No greeting. No wasted words. Parking lot. North side. 5 minutes. Ethan drove through the dark with Ranger beside him and found Olivia standing beneath a broken security light near the employee entrance of Harbor Lights. She wore a long gray coat over her scrubs, her auburn brown hair hidden beneath a knit cap, her narrow face pale from cold and fear. In one hand she held a small black USB drive, like it weighed more than a stone. "I copied what I could," she said, voice trembling. Medication logs, incident reports, screenshots from the hallway camera before they're overwritten. Some photos, too. Ethan looked at the drive but did not take it right away. "If you give me that," Denise comes after you." Olivia gave a tired laugh with no humor in it. "She already has. She just hasn't said my name out loud yet." Her gray-blue eyes lifted to his. "My mother is on dialysis in Ellsworth. Harbor Lights Insurance is the only reason I can keep her treatments covered. That's why I stayed quiet. That's why I hated myself every shift and still came back the next night." The confession hung between them with the snow. Ethan took the USB. "Fear makes prisoners of decent people," he said. "But you're standing outside now." Olivia's mouth shook once before she steadied it. "There's a clip of Denise taking your mother's phone. Ruth tried to call you last Tuesday. Denise told her she was upsetting herself and pulled the phone from her hand." She swallowed hard. "There are also medication changes that don't match the physician orders." Ethan's eyes sharpened. "Who signed them?" Denise initialed the nightly approvals, not always directly, sometimes through staff notes, but the pattern is there. Over the next 2 days, Ethan moved with the careful patience of a man who knew a bad step could collapse the whole bridge. He made copies of everything, stored them in 3 places, and began calling families. The first was Sarah Whitman, Mabel Turner's daughter. Sarah was 56, a short, broad-shouldered woman with curly chestnut hair, warm brown skin weathered by years of working as a school cafeteria manager, and a voice that had clearly spent decades telling children to stop running without ever losing kindness. At first, she resisted him. "Mr. Miller, Denise sends me pictures every week. Mom is always clean. She's smiling." Ethan sent one photograph Olivia had taken after Mabel was found in the cold bathing room. Blue lips, wet blanket, Ranger pressed against her legs like a furnace with fur. Sarah called back 3 minutes later, no longer sounding like a woman defending a care facility, but like a daughter whose heart had just been dragged out into the snow. "That's my mother," she whispered. "That's my mother." The second call went to Daniel Price, Leonard Pike's grandson. Daniel was 29, tall and lanky, with sandy hair, wire-framed glasses, and the restless impatience of a young software engineer more comfortable with screens than hospital corridors. He had believed Denise because believing was easier than admitting he had been too busy. When Ethan sent him a copy of Leonard's request log showing multiple denied phone calls, Daniel went quiet. "He told me they wouldn't let him call," Daniel said at last. "I thought he was confused. God, I told him he probably forgot." Shame made his voice brittle. Ethan did not soften the truth, but he did not sharpen it either. "Then listen now." The third family was Rebecca Cole, whose Aunt Harriet had become almost constantly sedated after complaining about missing jewelry. Rebecca was 62, thin and elegant, with silver-black hair cut at her jawline, pale green eyes, and a precise, controlled manner that suggested she had survived a lifetime by keeping her emotions ironed flat. She owned a small antique shop in Bangor and had trusted Harbor Lights because Denise spoke like the kind of woman who sent thank-you notes. When Rebecca saw the medication timeline, her composure cracked. "Harriet used to beat everyone at Scrabble," she said. "Last month, she could barely stay awake long enough to spell her own name." One by one, the beautiful mask Denise had sent into families' inboxes began to rot from the inside. Birthday cakes, group sing-alongs, residents smiling beside paper flowers. Every image had done its work. It had soothed guilt, quieted suspicion, and convinced busy sons and daughters that love could be outsourced if the lighting was warm enough. Ethan hated that most of all, because he had been among them. He had believed the polite updates, the soft voices, the clean sweaters. He had been fighting distant monsters while one sat beside his mother's bed with a clipboard. On the third evening, Olivia arranged for Ethan to enter Harbor Lights during a scheduled family records review. It was not enough to storm Denise's office like a raid. Every move had to look ordinary. Officer Brian Hallowell, perhaps troubled by Ruth's warning, had advised Ethan over the phone to document everything and avoid confrontation. "Give me something I can stand on," the officer had said. It was the first useful thing law had offered them. Olivia led Ethan to a small administrative filing room while Denise was meeting with a pharmacy representative in the front conference area. Ranger walked beside them, silent but intensely alert. The office smelled faintly of lavender spray and printer toner. Denise's desk was immaculate, each pen parallel, each folder squared. Ethan noticed a drawer slightly ajar beneath a side cabinet labeled Resident Personal Effects. Ranger noticed more. He moved to it, lowered his silver muzzle, sniffed once, then pawed at the drawer with a sharp scrape. Olivia's face drained of color. "That cabinet is supposed to be logged," she whispered. "Only items families ask us to store go there." Ethan pulled out his phone and began recording before Olivia touched anything. She opened the drawer with a key from her nurse ring, hands shaking but deliberate. Inside lay small pieces of stolen lives, a gold watch with a cracked face, a rosary with blue beads, a wedding ring in a plastic medicine cup, a child's drawing folded twice, and Ruth's silver locket. Ethan did not reach for it at first. He simply stared. The locket looked absurdly small among the evidence, yet it struck him harder than the medication logs. His mother had survived widowhood, fear, and the slow robbery of age, but someone had still decided she did not deserve to keep a 9-year-old boy's picture against her heart. Ranger gave a soft whine, and Ethan finally lifted the locket with a tissue, photographing its place before sealing it in a clear medication bag Olivia handed him. "This is theft," Olivia whispered. "No," Ethan said, voice low. "This is proof she wanted them empty." By Friday afternoon, the families were no longer isolated islands of doubt. Sarah drove up from Portland with Mabel's medical power of attorney documents in a red folder clutched to her chest. Daniel arrived, carrying printed call records and looking like a man who had not slept since hearing his grandfather's voice again in his head. Rebecca brought photographs of Harriet before Harbor Lights, bright-eyed, laughing, standing beside a Scrabble board with a victory grin. They met Ethan and Olivia in the back room of a small diner near the harbor, where the windows fogged from coffee steam and the waitress kept refilling mugs without asking questions. Ethan laid out the evidence in order, not dramatically, not like a man seeking pity, but like an operator briefing a mission where lives depended on clarity. Olivia spoke last. Her voice shook at first, then steadied as she described altered reports, excessive sedation, punishment through isolation, and Denise's method of making families feel foolish for questioning her. When she finished, Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. "You were scared," Sarah said, "but you're here now." It was a forgiveness Olivia had not asked for, and it nearly broke her. Together, they drafted a demand for an emergency board meeting, signed by multiple families and supported by attached evidence. The message went to Harbor Lights Governing Board before sunset, with copies to Officer Hallowell and the State Elder Services hotline. Denise responded within an hour. Her email was smooth, sorrowful, and poisonous. She welcomed the opportunity to address these painful misunderstandings and expressed concern about Mr. Miller's emotional state influencing vulnerable families. Ethan read it once, then handed the phone to Olivia. She looked at the words and shook her head. She still thinks she can talk her way out. Ethan glanced down at Ranger, who lay beside Ruth's locket under the diner table, guarding it as if it were a rescued child. "Then let her talk," he said. Outside, the harbor bells rang through the cold evening fog. For the first time since Ethan had walked into Harbor Lights, the fear was no longer moving in one direction. It was turning back toward the woman who had created it. The emergency board meeting was held the next evening, while Bar Harbor disappeared behind another wall of snow, the kind of storm that made the harbor bells sound far away and lonely, as if they were ringing from beneath the sea. Harbor Lights. Senior care glowed against the darkness with every window lit, but Ethan Miller no longer mistook light for safety. He entered through the front doors with Ranger at his left side and Ruth's silver locket sealed inside a clear evidence bag in his coat pocket. The old German shepherd moved slowly, his 9-year-old hips stiff from the cold, but his amber eyes were awake and hard. Ruth had been brought from her room by Olivia Grant 30 minutes earlier, wrapped in a cream wool sweater over her thin shoulders, her silver hair pinned carefully for the first time in days. She sat in a wheelchair near the far wall of the conference room, small beneath the fluorescent lights, but not empty. Not anymore. Ethan saw fear in her face, yes, but behind it lived something else, something faint and stubborn, like a coal that had survived under ash. The conference room smelled of coffee, wet coats, and nervous paper. Around the long oak table sat the board of Harbor Lights, people who had spent years approving budgets, reading cheerful reports, and believing that clean floors meant clean hearts. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Whitfield, the board chairwoman, 67 years old, tall and dignified, with silver hair cut in a smooth bob, dark brown eyes behind thin gold glasses, and the straight-backed posture of a retired hospital administrator who had once believed rules could protect the weak if good people followed them. Beside her was Arthur Bell, the treasurer, a 70-year-old former insurance man with a round belly, thinning white hair, pink cheeks, and watery blue eyes that blinked too often when conflict entered a room. He looked less cruel than comfortable, and comfort, Ethan knew, had its own kind of cowardice. Sarah Whitman sat near Mabel Turner, one hand wrapped around a red folder, her broad shoulders squared like she was ready to lift the whole table if the truth required it. Daniel Price sat with printed call records stacked before him, his wire-framed glasses sliding down his nose each time he looked from paper to Ruth. Rebecca Cole had placed Harriet's old Scrabble photograph beside her coffee cup like a small altar. Olivia stood against the wall near Ruth, pale but upright, her auburn brown hair tied more neatly than usual, though loose strands still framed her tired face. Then Denise Carlson entered. She wore a deep navy suit, pearl earrings, and the same flawless honey-blonde twist, every inch of her arranged like a sermon on innocence. Her smile was calm, sorrowful, almost maternal. She looked at the families first, then the board, then Ethan, never once letting her gaze linger on Ranger. "I'm grateful we're gathering to resolve this painful misunderstanding," Denise began, lowering herself into the chair opposite Eleanor. "Harbor Lights has always served vulnerable seniors with dignity. Unfortunately, recent events have been colored by fear, grief, and, I'm sorry to say, unresolved trauma." Her eyes moved gently toward Ethan, as if she pitied him. "Mr. Miller is a decorated veteran. I respect his service deeply, but combat changes people. It can make ordinary care procedures appear threatening. His dog, while no doubt loyal, has frightened staff and residents, and Nurse Grant, whose mother is gravely ill, has been under extreme personal stress." Olivia flinched, but did not look down. Denise folded her hands. "I believe we are seeing a tragedy of perception, not misconduct." For a moment, the room was quiet except for wind striking the windows. Ethan let the silence breathe. Denise expected anger. She expected him to defend himself first, to become the storm she had described. Instead, he placed a black folder on the table and opened it. "Perception doesn't leave bruises," he said. He laid out the first photographs. Ruth's wrist, Mabel's blue lips in the bathing room, Leonard Pike's denied call requests, Harriet Cole slumped asleep in a chair minutes after an undocumented sedative dose. Arthur Bell shifted in his seat. Eleanor leaned closer, her mouth tightening. Ethan placed medication logs beside physician orders. "These don't match," he said. Olivia stepped forward, voice shaking at first. "Those changes were entered during night shifts and marked as behavioral management. Several residents received increased sedatives after complaints or repeated family call requests. Some incident reports were rewritten before families received copies." Denise gave a soft, wounded laugh. "Olivia, you know how complicated geriatric care can be. Residents refuse meals, misremember falls, become distressed. Mabel didn't misremember being left in a freezing bathing room," Sarah cut in, her voice rough with restrained fury. "My mother counted songs to stay awake." Denise turned to her with practiced sorrow. "Mrs. Whitman, your mother has cognitive episodes." She remembered enough to say nobody came back. Daniel pushed his call records forward. My grandfather asked to call me 9 times in 2 weeks. I was told he was resting. He told me they wouldn't let him call, and I didn't believe him because you told me not to." His voice cracked on the last words, and shame moved through the room like a cold draft. Rebecca Cole lifted the photo of Harriet. "My aunt played tournament Scrabble for 20 years. After she complained about missing jewelry, she became too sedated to finish a sentence. That is not aging. That is management." Denise's smile thinned. "These are emotional interpretations." Ethan placed his phone on the table. "Then, let's use your voice." He pressed play. The recording from the administrative office filled the room, Denise's daytime sweetness replaced by something flat and sharp. "If you refuse, I will recommend immediate transfer to memory care, full-time supervision, limited phone access, no unscheduled visits, and if your son interferes again, I will have him removed from the property." No one spoke. Even the storm outside seemed to pause at the window. Denise's face did not collapse all at once. It cracked in stages, first the eyes, then the jaw, then the hands tightening together until her pearl bracelet dug into her skin. "That was taken out of context," she said. "Ruth was confused and escalating. I was trying to keep her safe." Ethan reached into his coat and placed the clear evidence bag on the table. Inside lay the silver locket. "This was found in your personal effects drawer with items belonging to other residents. No family authorization. No intake log." Eleanor Whitfield removed her glasses slowly. "Denise?" Denise straightened. "Small items are often secured to prevent loss." "Then why was my mother told she agreed to give it away?" Ethan asked. Denise looked toward Ruth and her expression changed. Not enough for strangers, but enough for Ethan. The softness vanished. Something cold looked out. "Ruth is not a reliable witness." The words landed softly, but they struck Ruth harder than a shout. For a second, the old woman seemed to shrink in her chair. Ranger moved before Ethan did, stepping beside Ruth and pressing his shoulder gently against her knee. Ruth's hand found his head. Her fingers trembled in his fur. Denise continued, sensing one final path. "Mrs. Miller is frightened and suggestible. She loves her son, of course, but she cannot separate his fear from reality. I do not think it is humane to force her into this." Ethan felt his body lean forward, but Olivia's hand touched his arm once, not stopping him. Reminding him. The truth did not need to be dragged if it could stand. Ruth looked at the table, then at Olivia, then at the locket. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Eleanor's voice softened. "Mrs. Miller, you don't have to speak." Ruth's fingers tightened around Ranger's fur. Slowly, painfully, she reached for the walker Olivia had placed beside her chair. Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to help. Every son in him wanted to lift her, shield her, make the room earn the right to look at her. But he remembered the porch of his childhood home, where Ruth had once taught him to ride a bicycle by letting go before he was ready, because love, she said, was not the same as holding on forever. Ruth pushed herself up. Her thin arms shook. Her knees trembled beneath the cream sweater and dark skirt. Ranger stood so close his body nearly touched the walker, steady as a carved guardian from some old northern myth. Ruth rose inch by inch until she was standing, small, bent, frightened, human. "I taught children for 40 years, she said, her voice fragile but clear enough to cross the room. "I taught them that truth does not need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to say it." Denise's face went pale. Ruth looked directly at her. "You told me I was a burden. You told me Ethan would suffer if I caused trouble. You took my phone. You took my locket. You made me afraid to trust my own mind." Her breath shook, but she did not sit. "I am old. I am tired. But I am not gone." The room held that sentence like a prayer. Sarah began crying silently. Daniel took off his glasses and covered his eyes. Olivia pressed both hands to her mouth. Eleanor Whitfield stood, her chair scraping sharply across the floor. "Denise Carlson. Effective immediately. You are suspended pending full investigation. Mr. Bell, contact State Elder Services. Officer Hallowell is already waiting outside, and I want him brought in now." Arthur Bell's hands shook as he reached for his phone. Denise stood too quickly. "You cannot do this based on hysteria." Eleanor's face hardened into something Ethan respected. "No, we should have done this before hysteria was the only language left to people we failed to hear." Officer Brian Hallowell entered moments later with 2 uniformed officers behind him, snow melting on their shoulders. He looked at Ethan once, then at Ruth, then at the evidence spread across the table. This time, Denise's words had nowhere soft to land. She was escorted from the room, still speaking, still insisting, still trying to stitch her mask back together as it came apart in her hands. When the door closed behind her, no one cheered. The damage was too deep for celebration. Ruth sank back into her chair, exhausted, and Ranger laid his head in her lap. She touched the silvered fur between his ears and closed her eyes. In that quiet room, with the storm beating against the glass and the truth finally standing in the open, Ruth Miller looked less like a victim than a woman returning from a long, dark country with her name still in her hands. 2 weeks after Denise Carlson was escorted out of Harbor Lights, the snow along the Maine coast began to loosen its grip, dripping from roofs in thin silver threads while the pine woods behind Ethan Miller's cabin breathed the first damp scent of approaching spring. The investigation had not healed everything at once. Truth rarely arrived like a clean sunrise. It came more like thawing ground, slow, muddy, painful, revealing what had been buried under winter. State inspectors moved through Harbor Lights with clipboards and hard eyes. Medication records were seized, staff schedules reviewed, family complaints reopened, and the cheerful photographs on the walls suddenly looked less like memories than evidence of how easily comfort could be staged. Denise was gone, suspended first, then named in a criminal investigation for coercion, neglect, falsified reports, and misuse of resident property. Some staff members resigned before they could be questioned. Others, like Kayla, stayed long enough to tell what they had seen and what they had been too afraid to say. Olivia Grant became the temporary patient care supervisor, not because she looked ready, but because she was finally willing to stand where others had stepped aside. She was still thin, still tired, still carrying shadows beneath her gray-blue eyes, but her voice no longer folded when authority entered the room. When she spoke to residents now, she did not glance over her shoulder. That alone felt like a small miracle. Ethan did not stay to watch Harbor Lights rebuild itself. His mission had narrowed to one person. On a cold Monday morning, with the sky pale and the roads streaked with dirty snow, he lifted Ruth Miller carefully into his black pickup and drove her away from the place that had tried to make her disappear. Ruth sat in the back beside Ranger, wrapped in her navy wool coat, her silver locket resting once again against her throat. The old German shepherd kept his body close to her knees, his black and tan fur brushing the blanket over her lap, his silver muzzle turned toward the window as if guarding every mile between Harbor Lights and home. Ruth did not speak much during the drive. She watched the pine trees pass, watched the frozen harbor shine gray through gaps in the road, watched the world return to her one fence post, one mailbox, one weathered church steeple at a time. Ethan's cabin stood several miles outside town near a stand of dark spruce trees, small and sturdy, built from pine logs and rough stone, with smoke rising from the chimney like a promise. He had spent nearly every hour since the board meeting preparing it. He widened the downstairs bedroom doorway, installed rails in the bathroom, moved his own books and old Navy gear into storage, and built a wooden ramp to the porch with the silent intensity of a man carving an apology into lumber. He did not tell Ruth how many times he had measured and remeasured the slope so her wheelchair would not jolt. He did not tell her how his hands shook the first night as he removed the old rug she might trip on. Ruth noticed anyway. Mothers often did. The first days were awkward in the tender way of broken things being set back in place. Ruth apologized for everything, for needing help standing, for spilling tea, for taking too long in the bathroom, for waking Ethan twice in one night after dreams pulled her back into locked hallways and fluorescent lights. Each apology landed on Ethan like a stone. He answered the same way every time, patient but firm. "You took care of me my whole life. Now I get a turn." Ruth would look away then, embarrassed by kindness as if kindness were a debt she could never repay. Ranger understood more than either of them said. Every night, he slept outside Ruth's bedroom door, his aging body stretched across the threshold like a furry old guardian of some sacred gate. When Ruth whimpered in her sleep, Ranger pushed the door open with his nose and rested his head on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed. Once, near dawn, Ethan found his mother awake, one thin hand buried in Ranger's fur, whispering the names of students she had taught 30 years earlier. Ranger listened solemnly, as if every lost name were a command worth obeying. Healing did not arrive in a straight line. Some mornings Ruth woke sharp and almost herself, correcting Ethan's grammar while he read the newspaper aloud. Other mornings she sat by the window with her hands folded in her lap, afraid to ask for breakfast because old fear had trained her voice to stay small. Ethan learned not to rush her. War had taught him how to move fast, but love, he discovered, required the opposite kind of courage. It required standing still while someone found the strength to reach back toward the world. By mid-March, Ruth began changing in small, holy ways. She brushed her own hair again, pinning it into the low silver bun that made her look like the teacher Ethan remembered from his childhood, the woman who could silence a room of third-graders with one raised eyebrow and then secretly slip extra cookies to the shyest child. She folded dish towels near the fireplace, sorted Ethan's mismatched socks with grave disapproval, and planted a small pot of basil on the kitchen windowsill because, as she told Ranger, men cannot be trusted to keep anything green alive. Ethan heard her laugh for the first time on a rainy afternoon when he burned the coffee so badly the whole kitchen smelled like a shipwreck. Ruth took one sip, made a face, and said, "You brew coffee like a sailor with a grudge against civilization." Ethan stared at her for half a second, then laughed so quietly it nearly broke him. Ranger, sensing joy but misunderstanding its source, thumped his tail against the floor and looked hopeful for food. News from Harbor Lights came in pieces. Mabel Turner was recovering with her daughter Sarah. Leonard Pike had spoken with Daniel every evening for 10 straight days. Harriet Cole was being evaluated by a new doctor, and Rebecca reported that her aunt had beaten her at Scrabble again, though she had used a questionable word and defended it like a courtroom lawyer. Harbor Lights was placed under new management, with family visitation policies changed, medication reviews overseen by outside physicians, and personal items logged with witness signatures. Olivia called once to tell Ruth that several residents had asked about Ranger. Ruth smiled at that. "Tell them he accepts payment in biscuits and praise," she said. "Mostly biscuits." Late in March, the morning came bright and cold, with sunlight flashing on melting snow, and the sea wind smelling less like punishment and more like salt. Ruth stood at the cabin doorway with both hands gripping her walker. She wore a cream sweater, dark slacks, and her navy coat, the silver locket shining at her throat. Ethan stood behind her, close enough to catch her, far enough not to steal the victory. Ranger stepped onto the ramp first, then turned back, ears lifted, waiting. Ruth took one step. The walker clicked against the wood, then another. Her knees trembled, and her breath grew uneven, but she kept moving until she reached the porch rail. Ethan's hands remained at his sides, though every part of him wanted to help. Ruth stood there beneath the thin sunlight, looking over the pines toward the distant gray-blue strip of ocean. "I thought I had become a burden," she said. Ethan swallowed. "No, Mom. You were the reason I remembered which side I was supposed to stand on." Ruth did not answer at once. She placed one hand on Ranger's head and the other on the porch rail, holding both loyalty and home. That evening, she cooked chicken soup for the first time since leaving Harbor Lights, moving slowly but stubbornly around the kitchen while Ethan hovered until she ordered him to sit down before he wore a trench in the floor. The soup tasted of celery, pepper, and childhood. Ranger lay under the table pretending to sleep, one eye open, waiting for a carrot to fall like manna from heaven. Outside the window, snow melted into tiny streams across the yard. Inside, firelight touched the wooden walls, Ruth's laughter warmed the room, and Ethan Miller understood that some rescues did not end when the villain fell. Some rescues began afterward in the daily work of reminding the wounded that they were still wanted, still heard, still home. Sometimes the miracles God sends into our lives do not arrive with thunder, golden light, or angels standing at the door. Sometimes they come quietly, through the loyal eyes of a dog, the trembling courage of an elderly mother, the guilty heart of someone who finally chooses to speak, or the steady hands of a son who refuses to walk past suffering. This story reminds us that no one becomes less worthy of love because they grow old, weak, frightened, or dependent on others. In everyday life, there are people around us who may be suffering in silence: an aging parent, a lonely neighbor, a forgotten veteran, a tired caregiver, or someone too afraid to ask for help. God often works through ordinary people who are willing to notice, willing to listen, and willing to stand beside those the world has stopped seeing. Kindness is never weakness. Compassion is never wasted. And sometimes, one small act of courage can become the answer to someone's prayer. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, or share the moment in this story that moved you the most. And if you believe in stories of faith, courage, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more heartfelt stories like this. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace into your home, heal the wounds no one else can see, and place a light in your heart even during the darkest seasons of life.